The brass survey stake at Marker 7 North was found bent double at a perfect right angle, still driven into ground that the thermal basin made physically impossible to freeze, and whatever bent it had not done so from outside the earth but from below. That was the fourth morning. I want to tell you what the first 3 nights felt like before we got there, because the cold came before the stake, and the stake was just the moment it stopped being patient with us. My name is Raymond Casper Flood. In 1961, I was 34 years old, employed by the Interior Department as a senior field surveyor out of the Boise District Office, and I had been doing topographic work in federal wilderness corridors since 1952. I am not a man who came to this account through imagination, or grief, or any particular appetite for the strange. I came to it the same way you come to a fence post in the dark. You walk into it before you see it, and afterward you cannot pretend it was not there. The folklorist speaking to me now is the second person I have told the full account to. The first was my wife, in the winter of 1961, approximately 6 weeks after we came out of the backcountry. She listened without interruption, and when I finished, she poured coffee for both of us and said that she believed me, and we have not discussed it since, because there is nothing more to say between two people who already share a conclusion. I am talking to you now, in the summer of 1979, because I have spent 18 years watching that corridor accumulate a second history. I will tell you about that history at the end. But I want to start at the beginning, at the Fort Hall Agency, with what the elder said to us before we left. The survey assignment came down in late August of that year. The Interior Department had been working through a systematic effort to complete topographic coverage of all backcountry quadrants within the Yellowstone boundary, and there was a corridor northwest of Shoshone Lake, running approximately 12 miles along a restricted interior ridge that had appeared as a white space on every prior federal map for as long as anyone in the Boise office could trace. The senior cartographer who briefed us on the assignment referred to the omission as an administrative gap. He said those words without apparent discomfort. When I asked him what the prior survey teams had documented in that corridor, meaning the teams who had presumably been dispatched and returned without completing the work, he told me that the records were incomplete. He said it the same way you say the weather was fine. No further explanation was offered, and I did not push for one, because I was 34 and working, and a white space on a federal map read to me then as nothing more than a professional obligation waiting to be closed. We were 4 men. I will tell you the ones who matter. The project lead was a man named Gerald Noss, 41 years old, a career interior man who had surveyed in Alaska, Idaho, and the Wind River Range. He was precise, organized, and operated from a conviction that the natural world arranged itself according to principles that could be measured and recorded, and that the job of men like us was to do the measuring without editorializing. I respected him. I want to be clear about that. The disagreement that developed between us in that basin was not a failure of respect. It was 2 different kinds of certainty meeting a third thing that neither of us had vocabulary for, and I am the one who is still here to talk about it, which does not mean I was right. It means I ran faster. The instrument man was a surveyor named Douglas Peel, 28 years old, from the Twin Falls office, on his 3rd full field season. He was good with the transit and careful with the rod work, and he had the particular quality of the best field men, which is that he noticed things without making a production of noticing them. He was the first one to comment on the cold, on the second night, and he said it quietly, to me and not to Noss, because he had already read the room correctly. The third man was Harlon Kovville, 26 years old, junior surveyor, first full backcountry season, eager in the specific way that young men are eager before something teaches them to be less so. He is the reason I am talking to you. He is why the full account has to be told. What happened to Colville is not a mystery to me, whatever the Park Service concluded in their search report, and I will come to it in the right order. We traveled from Boise to Pocatello in mid-September, and before we drove north to the park boundary, we stopped at the Fort Hall Agency as a matter of standard protocol. The Interior Department had a standing requirement that survey teams operating in Yellowstone's backcountry notify the relevant tribal liaison offices before entering areas with documented traditional use significance. The quadrant northwest of Shoshone Lake had been flagged for this notification, and I remember reading the flag in the briefing materials and thinking it was a formality. We would check in, get a signature, move on. The man we met at Fort Hall was not introduced to me by name, and I will not speculate about it now. He was an elder, clearly. He was sitting at a table in a side room of the agency building when the liaison brought us in, and he looked at the four of us without particular expression and asked which corridor we were working. When Nos named the quadrant, the old man was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if we intended to night camp in the basin or stage from the park boundary. Nos told him we would be night camping. The survey required 3 weeks of instrument work, and the access trail was too long for daily staging. The old man nodded slowly. He said that the ground in that corridor was not surveyed, had not been surveyed, and should not be surveyed after the first frost. He said this in English, plainly, without ceremony or elevation. He was not performing a warning. He was stating a condition. Nos asked him if there was a specific environmental or cultural concern we should document. The old man looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "The concern is that you do not come back." Nos thanked him for his time, and we left. I want to tell you what I thought in the truck after that meeting, because it matters. I thought the elder was doing what elders often do, which is protecting territory through the language of warning, and I thought it with the easy confidence of a man who has not yet had the experience that revises his categories. I am not proud of that. But I want you to understand how completely ordinary everything felt at that moment. The sky was clear. The day was warm. Nos was talking about the access trail mileage, and Peel was reviewing the instrument manifest, and Colville was eating an apple in the back seat. Nothing about the inside of that truck said we were about to spend 3 weeks breaking something that had been kept intact for longer than the federal government had existed. We entered the backcountry on the morning of September 14, 1961. The access trail ran 11 miles from the staging point near the Park Road to the edge of the survey corridor, and we carried full packs, transit, leveling rods, stakes, and 3 weeks of provisions. The thermal basin begins about 2 miles before you reach the restricted quadrant, and I want you to understand the geography because it matters to what I am about to describe. The ground in that area is hydrothermally active. The soil is warm to the touch in most places. Standing pools of superheated water appear without warning at the margins of the trail. Fumarole vents push steam from cracks in the earth, at temperatures that would cook your hand if you held it over them for more than a few seconds. In mid-September, the ambient temperature in the corridor is perhaps 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoon, cool but not cold. The thermal activity means that certain areas of the ground are measurably warmer than the air above them, and experienced backcountry people in Yellowstone learn quickly that the warmest places to stand are often directly above geological features that could kill you in a different way. The point is this: it is not a cold place. It is, in most ways, the opposite of a cold place. We made camp on the first night approximately half a mile inside the survey corridor, on a flat ground beside a low ridge. The night was clear, temperature dropping into the mid-30s, normal for the season. I slept well. Nothing notable occurred. I want to tell you now about Marker 7 North, because the stake was already in the ground when we arrived. It had been placed by a prior survey crew, dating, based on the stamp on the cap, to 1938. That marker represented the work of the only previous interior team I could find any trace of that had entered that corridor, and they had placed stakes at 6 positions before their records simply stop. There is no completion report, no withdrawal notation, no incident filing. The record ends at Marker 6, and then there is nothing, and Marker 7 North exists in the ground because someone drove it there and then apparently was not present to drive Marker 8. We found it on the second day of work, and Nos noted it in the field log as prior survey infrastructure and moved on. I looked at it for a while. It was straight then, properly driven, the cap level to the eye. I made a note of the 1938 stamp. I will come back to what it looked like on the fourth morning. The cold arrived on the second night. I am going to describe this with care, because I have described it before, to myself mostly, and the temptation is always to reach for meteorological language that makes it feel explicable. I am not going to do that. I am going to tell you what it felt like, which is the only honest account I have. I was in my sleeping bag, fully dressed against the nighttime temperature, and I came awake at some point in the small hours of the morning with the specific sensation that I had left a window open in a cold room. Not that the tent was cold, not that the night had gotten colder. The sensation was of something pressing against my body from outside the sleeping bag, a contact chill, the kind of cold you feel through fabric when someone presses an ice block against it. My skin registered it as touch. That is the word I keep coming back to. It felt like contact. I lay still for a moment. I was in a tent, in a thermal basin, with fumarole vents visible from the tent door. The ground beneath my sleeping pad was warm. The thermal activity of the area creates a measurable heat gradient from the ground upward, and I had felt it clearly when I laid my hands on the earth before turning in. And yet the cold was there, pressed against my body from no specific direction, surrounding rather than striking. Not a draft, not a temperature gradient from the tent wall. Something that had arrived. It lasted perhaps 20 minutes by my watch, and then it was gone. I lay awake after it passed. In the morning I said nothing, because I had no framework for saying it, and I was the senior field man on the team, and there is a particular silence that professional men keep around experiences they cannot yet categorize. Peel found me at the cook fire and poured coffee, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has also spent time since 3 in the morning deciding whether or not to say something. "Did you sleep all right?" he said. "Well enough," I said. He nodded and drank his coffee and did not say more. But I watched his face, and I understood that we had felt the same thing, and were both, for that morning, choosing the professional silence. Nos slept soundly, as far as I could tell. Kovville seemed fine. We broke camp and began the second day of instrument work, and the morning was clear and the transit ran true, and the ridge shots came back consistent. By noon I had convinced myself of a reasonable explanation involving a cold air inversion from the higher elevation to the north, and the technical precision of the work had reasserted its usual authority over everything else. This is what survey work does for you. It gives you numbers, and numbers are steadying in a way that feelings are not, and I was a man who had been trusting numbers for 9 years. The cold came back the second night, closer. I do not mean it arrived at a closer time, though it did that too, appearing not at 3 in the morning as the first night, but at what I estimated was 11:30. I mean it felt closer to my body, more direct. The first night it had felt like contact through distance, as if something was pressing against the tent wall from outside. The second night it felt like being held, not gripped, not restrained. Held, a surrounding, enveloping cold that had me at its center, pressing inward from all sides simultaneously, without source and without variation across the body. Not colder at my feet than my shoulders, not colder on the tent wall side than the center of the bag. Equal, surrounding, and deliberate. That last word appeared in my mind while I lay in it, and I held on to it and tested it, because deliberate is not a temperature word. Deliberate is an intention word, and the only honest record I have of what I felt in that sleeping bag on the second night is that the cold felt like it was paying attention to me specifically. It lasted 40 minutes. I did not sleep after it passed. In the morning I spoke to Peel before Nos was up, in a low voice beside the fire, and told him what I had experienced. He was quiet through my description. Then he said that it had found him too, and that it had felt like lying down in cold water, except the cold water was inside everything, including him. Those were his words. Inside everything. He was a precise man who measured things for a living, and that was the precision he could offer. We debated, quietly, whether to tell Nos. We decided to wait one more night and see if it continued. That decision is one I have reviewed many times since. Not with guilt, exactly. With a different feeling. Something like the recognition that the outcome of that particular choice was already built into the choice itself, and that knowing that would not have changed what I chose, because I was still a professional man operating in a professional framework, and in that framework you do not report a feeling to your project lead. You report readings, you report measurements, you report observations that can be verified. The cold was real, but it was not measurable, and everything I had been trained to value lived in the gap between real and measurable. That is the gap that the thing in that corridor lives in. The third day of instrument work was unremarkable and proceeded according to plan. We shot 11 stations along the northern ridge and extended the traverse by approximately 900 feet, which put us ahead of schedule. Nos was in good spirits. He had a quality of focused satisfaction when the work was running clean that I recognized as the professional equivalent of happiness. And on the third afternoon it was fully present in him. The sky was clear, the sight lines were good, Kovville's rod work was improving, and by the time we made camp for the third night, we had covered more ground than the schedule allowed for. Nos noted in the field log that if this pace held, we might complete the survey in 18 days rather than 21. I want to note something that I did not have the full vocabulary for at the time, but have since come to see clearly. The thermal basin in which we were working is not silent. The vents push steam with a constant low hiss. The pools tick and bubble. The ground itself has sound, a slow internal pressure that comes up through your boot soles as much as you hear it with your ears. And on the first 2 days of work, this ambient sonic environment had been consistent and present, part of the landscape's texture. On the third afternoon, as we were breaking down the instrument for the day, I noticed that the hiss from the nearest vent cluster had changed. Not stopped, changed. The quality of the steam sound had flattened in some way I could not precisely identify, as if the acoustics of the basin had shifted, as if the sound was passing through something that had not been there before. I noticed it, filed it as a barometric oddity, and moved on. I mention it now because it was the first change in the basin's behavior that was external to me, the first sign that was not a private sensation, but a feature of the environment itself, and I was not paying attention the right way yet. The third night the cold came at 9 in the evening. I know the exact time because I was awake and reading the field log by lantern when it arrived. It came in not gradually, but as a single transition, the way a door opens onto cold air, a threshold crossed rather than a condition approached. The lantern flame did not gutter. The canvas of the tent did not move. But within the space of perhaps 2 seconds, the interior of the tent changed from the ambient temperature of a cool September evening to something that registered against my face and hands as severe, as the kind of cold that tightens the skin and creates an involuntary physical alertness. I looked at the lantern. It burned steadily. There was no draft. I looked at the tent wall. No movement. I got up and went outside. I want to describe what the basin looked like at 9 o'clock on the night of September 16, 1961, because it is the most clearly I have ever seen the place I was standing in, and because what I am about to tell you about the tree line will make more sense if you understand the visual context first. The moon was up, nearly full, and the thermal vents around the camp were pushing their steam columns into the night air, each one lit from below by the heat of the earth. The steam rose in slow white columns and bent in the upper air, where a light wind was moving, and the visual effect was of multiple dim torches burning at ground level around the camp perimeter, each one producing light by accident rather than design. The ground between the vents was pale in the moonlight. The ridge to the north was dark against a sky that had the deep blue-black clarity of high-elevation nights. No cloud, no haze. The tree line was roughly 60 yards from camp, running east to west along the southern margin of the cleared basin floor. The cold was present outside the tent as well as inside it. Standing in it, I could feel it arranged around me, a shell of cold that moved when I moved and stayed in contact with my body, without variation. I turned in a full circle, and it turned with me. I walked 4 steps toward the fire, and it walked with me. I stopped beside the fire ring and held my hands over the coals, which were still showing red from dinner, and the heat from the coals reached my palms, but the cold was on my back and shoulders and neck, as though it were leaning against me from behind. Then I looked at the tree line. I do not have the right vocabulary, and I am not going to pretend to construct one. I will tell you what I registered with my eyes. There was a place in the tree line, roughly centered on the camp's southern exposure, where the shadow was different from the shadow on either side of it. Not darker exactly, more solid, more present, the kind of solid that has a reason for being there. I stood beside the fire for perhaps 2 minutes looking at it, and during those 2 minutes the place in the tree line did not move or change or produce any further evidence of itself. But the cold against my back and shoulders did not vary either, and there was a quality to the stillness at that part of the tree line that was not the stillness of trees and shadow. I went back into the tent. I woke Peel. I told him what I had seen. He was quiet. Then he said we needed to tell Nos in the morning. The cold stayed through most of the night and was gone by dawn. Nos listened to the full account at breakfast the next morning. Peel and I gave it plainly, without embellishment, covering the 2 prior nights' sensations, the 3rd night's timing and intensity, and what I had seen at the tree line. Nos listened without interrupting. When we finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that the cold sounded consistent with a temperature inversion phenomenon associated with thermal basins at night, that the visual anomaly at the tree line was likely a product of low-light optical illusion combined with sleep deprivation, and that both of these were documented environmental factors in extended backcountry survey work. He said it without dismissiveness. He said it the way a careful man states a careful position. I did not argue, because the explanation was not impossible. It was just incomplete. We broke camp and began the 4th day's work, and that is the day we found Marker 7 North. The stake was approximately 400 feet east of the previous night's camp, on a line of previously placed datum points running toward the northern ridge. It had been vertical the last time I saw it. Now it was bent at a right angle from the ground, pointing east, the cap touching the surface of the earth. It was still in the ground. The lower section of the stake, below the bend, was still driven to its original depth. The bend was clean, a single compression, not a fracture. Whatever had applied force to that stake had not broken it. It had folded it. The ground around it was frozen. I want to repeat that. The ground in a thermal basin where the hydrothermal gradient maintains soil temperatures measurably above freezing, even in midwinter, was, in a circle of approximately 3 feet radius around Marker 7 North, frozen solid to a depth that I could not penetrate with a probe rod, not frost-hardened, frozen. The surface cracked when I stepped on it, and the break showed ice crystals at a depth of at least 4 inches. I stood on that frozen ground with fumarole steam rising 10 feet behind me, and I pressed my palm to it and felt the absolute cold of it through my glove. Peel came up beside me and stood looking at it for a long moment. Nos crouched beside the stake and examined the bend. He touched the frozen ground. He stood up and turned to look at the basin, the vents, the steam. He did not say anything. Kovville was the one who said what all of us were thinking, in the specific way that the youngest man on a team will sometimes say the obvious thing because he has not yet learned the professional silence. He said, "That shouldn't be possible." "No," I said. "It shouldn't." Nos noted the observation in the field log. He described the stake as showing deformation, consistent with mechanical pressure of undetermined origin, and the surrounding ground as showing unusual thermal characteristics, inconsistent with the local hydrothermal environment. He documented it with the same careful precision he brought to instrument readings, and then he said we should continue. We continued. That afternoon, 2 things happened that I did not connect until later, but which I believe now were connected from the start. The first was that the instrument work began running wrong. Not dramatically, subtly. The transit readings at 3 consecutive stations returned angles that were inconsistent with each other in ways that were small enough to attribute to instrument error, but consistent enough to be noticed. Peel rechecked the level twice. He collimated the telescope. The readings continued to come back with a small but persistent discrepancy that he could not account for, as if the instrument were being asked to measure a geometry that did not hold still. He made note of it without escalating, the professional way, and flagged the 3 stations for re-observation. The second thing was that the birds were gone. I do not mean that we noticed an absence in a dramatic way, as if the sound had cut off. I mean that at some point in the early afternoon, I became aware that since the previous morning, I had not heard a single bird call, and that this absence extended in all directions as far as I could determine. The thermal basin has its own bird populations, adjusted to the environment, and they are not numerous, but they are present and audible. On the first 3 days of work, I had heard them consistently in the background of the instrument work, the small sounds of living wildlife going about its business around us. On the 4th day, nothing. Silence in the basin that was not the silence of weather or season, but the silence of everything that lives there, deciding not to be present. I made a note of it in my personal field log, the private one I kept alongside the official record, and I wrote 3 words: "Things are withdrawing." I do not know precisely what I meant by that when I wrote it, only that the word withdrawing came naturally and without second thought, which suggests to me now that somewhere below the professional framework, I had already arrived at a conclusion I was not ready to state. We made camp that 4th night with the day's work partially complete and the 3 flagged stations still unresolved. Noss was still in reasonable spirits, but quieter than the previous evenings. Kovville had not spoken much since the discovery of the bent stake. Peel and I exchanged no significant conversation, but the specific quality of our silence was the silence of 2 people who have agreed on something without saying it. After dinner, when Noss had turned in and Kovville was sitting by the fire, I spoke to Peel. I told him that I thought we should consider pulling out, not with cause, not with documentation of an incident that would satisfy a regional director's request for justification, but on the basis of judgment. I used the word judgment. I meant it as the opposite of measurement. I meant it as the thing you do when the numbers stop telling the whole truth. Peel looked at the fire for a moment. He said that he agreed with me, but that Noss would not agree, and that without Noss's concurrence, we were talking about abandoning a federal assignment mid-survey, which carried its own professional consequences. He said we should tell Noss in the morning and give him the full picture, the cold, the stake, the instrument discrepancies, the birds, the tree line on the 3rd night, all of it together, and see if the accumulation of it changed his position. That was the right call, and I agreed to it. And I want to tell you why it was also the wrong call. It was the wrong call not because Noss would have listened differently, though he might have, but because the morning was too late. The thing in that basin was not operating on our timeline. It was operating on its own, and its timeline had already moved past the point of negotiation. The cold came at 4 in the afternoon on the 5th day. Full daylight, blue sky, mid-afternoon light on the basin floor. I was at the instrument, turning a horizontal angle to a prism rod that Kovville was holding on the north ridge, and the cold arrived around me, as it had the previous nights, the surrounding shell of it, the contact quality, the sense of being held at the center of something that had its own distinct edge. I straightened up from the eyepiece. Peel, who was recording the angles, had gone still beside his notebook. Across the basin, Kovville turned slowly and looked at us, and even at 200 yards I could see that he felt it too. The transit read flatline. I want to be specific about this, because it has stayed with me more clearly than almost anything else from that survey. A surveying transit is a mechanical optical instrument. It measures angles. It does not have electronic components that can fail to a 0 reading. The concept of a flat line is not applicable to it in the mechanical sense. But the graduated circles, which display angular values in degrees, minutes, and seconds, were showing 0 on all axes simultaneously, as if the instrument had lost its orientation to every reference simultaneously. When I looked at the level vials, the bubbles were not centered. They were also not anywhere. The tubes were empty. Not dry, empty. The fluid that allows a bubble to exist was gone, and I do not mean evaporated. I mean gone. Peel's thermometer, which he kept in his shirt pocket as a habit, a simple field thermometer on a chain, was reading below the lowest calibration mark on its scale. He showed it to me without speaking. And then I looked at the tree line, because I knew already that the tree line was where I needed to look. And what I saw there is the thing I have spent 18 years working toward describing and still cannot do justice to. It was large, not in a way that resolved into specific dimensions at distance. Large in the way that things are large that do not fit the category of large things you already know, so that the eye receives the information and then searches without success for a frame to put it in. It was at the edge of the trees, not inside them, standing where the shadow began, and it was the color of the shadow, not as camouflage but as identity, as if the shadow was what it was made of rather than what it hid in. It had height. It had presence in the vertical sense that is different from width, that registers not as size but as column, as thing that reaches from earth toward sky. And it was looking at us. I cannot give you detail about its face, or whether it had a face in the way that word applies to animals we recognize. I can tell you that there was a quality of directed attention, of specific focus, aimed at the 4 of us in the basin, that I felt as physical pressure on my sternum, a pushing inward. The cold was at its maximum around us, full contact, full immersion, and the thing at the tree line was the source of it. I understood that at the same instant I saw it. The cold was not a weather event. The cold was it, or something it was producing, or something that arrived in its presence, the way cold arrives in the presence of ice. It was looking at us across the basin, with the focused attention of something that has been in that basin for a very long time and is entirely clear about what it wants. It did not move. It did not need to. I turned to Nos, who had come out of the equipment tent when the cold arrived and was standing 8 feet from me, and I said, "Gerald." He was looking at the tree line. He was very still. "Gerald, we need to leave now," I said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Get the stakes. Leave the transit." That was Gerald Nos at the end of his argument. A man who had held his professional position against everything the previous 4 days had produced, and then looked at the tree line in the full light of a September afternoon and reduced his position to 4 words. I did not feel vindicated. There was no room for vindication. I felt the cold against my body, and I felt the directed weight of that attention across the distance of the basin, and I understood with complete clarity that the thing at the tree line had been reducing the distance between itself and us over the previous 4 nights, with a specific architectural purpose, arriving closer on each subsequent night, letting us feel the cold earlier and longer, and that what we were experiencing now, in full afternoon light with all our instruments failed, was not an escalation. It was a conclusion. We had been brought to this moment deliberately, in the same way you bring a settlement to a table. You apply pressure until the other party is ready to receive terms. We packed nothing except our personal gear and 1 bag of provisions that Peel assembled, in the time it took me to pull 4 stakes from the ground and get Kovville moving toward the trail. We left the transit on its tripod. We left the leveling rods. We left the rod bag, the instrument cases, the full stake kit. We left 3 weeks of field notes, observed angles, rod readings and traverse calculations in the document case inside the equipment tent. 3 weeks of work representing the most complete topographic coverage that corridor had ever received, the only modern survey record of that ground that existed or would ever exist, given what had happened to every previous attempt. We left it. I was at the trail entry when I turned and saw that Kovville was not with us. He had gone back. I could see him across the basin, moving toward the equipment tent at a fast walk, not a run, the walk of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it. He had left his pack and was carrying nothing, which told me he had gone back for the transit case, the large wooden case that held the instrument itself, which was the most valuable single item we had in the field. Peel called his name. Kovville did not turn. I have reviewed this moment more times than I can count in the 18 years since it occurred, and I am not able to tell you with complete certainty what I should have done differently. Going back across that basin myself would have left us with 2 men in the basin and 2 men at the trail. Calling for longer would have delayed the group without guarantee of result. What I chose was to hold position at the trail entry and call for Kovville to come back, with Peel calling beside me, while Noss stood behind us and looked at the tree line and said nothing. Kovville reached the equipment tent. I watched him go inside it. The cold, which had been at its maximum intensity since the thing appeared at the tree line, did not intensify further. It held. The thing at the tree line did not move. After approximately 2 minutes, Kovville came back out of the equipment tent. He was carrying the transit case with both hands, the wooden case held against his chest. He turned toward the trail. He walked perhaps 30 feet toward us, and then he stopped. He stopped in the way that a man stops when something has been said to him, not when something has grabbed him, not when he has tripped or fallen. He stopped and turned his head to the right, looking toward the south end of the basin, away from the tree line, away from us. He stood like that for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he set the transit case down on the ground with care, the way you set down a thing you have decided not to take, and he turned and looked at us from across the basin. He was too far away for me to read his expression. He said something. I could see that his lips moved. I could not hear it across the distance. Then he turned and walked south, into the basin, away from us, and I watched him go until he passed behind the steam columns from the vent cluster, and I could no longer see him. The cold at the tree line held through all of this. The dark shape held its position. And I stood at the trail entry and made the calculation that a man makes when the options have been reduced to 2, and neither of them is acceptable, and time is making the choice for you. We left. I have told you about the cold and the stake and the tree line and Kovville walking away into the basin. I want to tell you now about the walkout because it was 11 miles, and I need you to understand that the cold did not follow us. That is the sentence that has occupied more of my thinking than any other single fact of that survey. The cold did not follow us. It stopped at the basin margin. Within perhaps 100 yards of leaving the corridor proper, the cold was gone, as cleanly and completely as it had arrived on the second night, a threshold crossed, rather than a condition that faded. The ambient temperature of the mountain trail returned to the normal September evening range, and my body registered the change with a physical shock of contrast, the way your skin responds when you walk out of a cold room into warm air, except this was the reverse. This was warmth returned after being held in cold, and the feeling of it was not relief. It was something closer to grief, because Kovville was still in the basin. We reached the trailhead at dawn the following day, approximately 14 hours of hiking through the night, with one rest stop. We drove to the park boundary station and reported that we had a man missing in the backcountry. I gave the location, I gave the timeline, I gave as complete a description of the events as the station ranger seemed capable of receiving, which was not complete. When I reached the part about the cold and the shape at the tree line, he wrote down that we had experienced equipment failures and possible disorientation in the thermal basin. I watched him write it. I did not correct it. A search party entered the corridor the following morning. They searched for 6 days. They found the equipment tent with all our gear still in it, the transit still on its tripod, the transit case sitting on the basin floor approximately 30 feet from the tent. They found Kovville's pack near the trail entry. They did not find Kovville. After 6 days, the Park Service supervisor filed an administrative closure indicating that the search had been conducted to appropriate standards and the subject could not be located, and the case was referred to the Wyoming State Missing Persons Registry with a notation of probable wilderness fatality, undetermined cause. There was no inquest. There was no official inquiry into the survey conditions. The 3-week field record we had left in the equipment tent was recovered and returned to the Boise district office, and I was told that it had been reviewed and filed. When I asked whether the survey would be completed, I was told that the assignment was under administrative review. I never received another communication about it. In the spring of 1962, I requested the official status of the corridor survey through the district cartography office, and was informed that no current survey assignment existed for that quadrant. When I asked what maps were being used for administrative purposes in that area, I was told that existing maps were adequate for current needs. The corridor remains unmapped. I left the Interior Department in 1963. I had 2 more years of survey work after the Yellowstone assignment, in southern Idaho and the Bitterroot, and the work was competent and unremarkable, and I did it without incident, and without the particular quality of attention I gave it before September of 1961. The professional framework had survived the experience in a technical sense. The professional man had not. I want to tell you now about the 4 people I mentioned to the folklorist at the beginning of this account, because this is the part that I have spent the most time with, and it is the part that has given the experience its full shape in my understanding. The first person I tracked down was a backcountry ranger, a woman named Frances Gould, who had filed for a personal research permit for the Shoshone Lake Northwest Corridor in the spring of 1967. I found her through a contact at the Park Administration Office, who I had known since my survey years. She had submitted the permit, received approval after a 2-week processing period, entered the corridor with a single companion on a 3-day itinerary, and returned on the first day. She filed no incident report. When I reached her by telephone, she was reluctant to speak, and then spoke for nearly 40 minutes. She said the cold came the first night, within 2 hours of making camp. She said it felt like being measured. She had no other description to offer, and seemed frustrated by this. She said she and her companion had looked at each other across the fire and stood up and began packing without a word exchanged between them. She said they did not discuss it until they were back at the trailhead. I asked her if she had told anyone. She said she had told her companion, who had never mentioned it again, and had, as far as she knew, not spoken of it to anyone. She said she had not returned to the corridor, and did not intend to. When I asked if she had seen anything, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "At the edge of the trees, yes, but only for a second. I don't want to describe it." I told her I understood, because I did. The second person was a former park naturalist who had been granted a vegetation survey permit for an adjacent quadrant in the summer of 1971, a permit that technically did not include the restricted corridor, but whose boundary ran along the corridor's eastern edge. He had spent 5 days in the adjacent area, and on the 5th day crossed the boundary to take a measurement on a thermal feature that he believed required documentation for his vegetation study. He had been in the restricted corridor for approximately 45 minutes when the cold arrived in the early afternoon, and he had turned around immediately and left. He told me he had felt something looking at him from the tree line. He said he had the clear impression that he was being given one chance to leave of his own accord. He took it. He did not include the boundary crossing in his official survey report, and he destroyed the notes he had taken during those 45 minutes, because he did not want them attached to his professional record. He said he had spent years wondering if he was wrong to trust that impression, and then he said he had spent years being glad he did. The third person was a journalist from a Bozeman newspaper who had received a tip about the unmapped corridor from a source he would not name and had obtained a recreational hiking permit for an adjacent area in the fall of 1973, intending to hike as close to the corridor boundary as the permit allowed and document the terrain for a story about federal land management gaps. He had entered the area, hiked for 2 days, and filed nothing. When I found him and asked about the story, he said there was no story. When I pressed him, he said there was a story, but he was not going to write it because he could not explain what had happened without sounding deranged, and the newspaper had enough problems without that. He would not give me details. He would only say that he had gotten close to the boundary on the second evening and that something had been waiting there. He said the word waiting. He said it was not a word he used lightly and was the only word that applied. He had gone back to the trailhead that night, filed a trip completion form stating that he had completed his intended itinerary and never returned to that part of the park. The story he was working on was never published. When I asked what he thought was in that corridor, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think it's old. Old enough that old isn't the right word anymore." The fourth person I cannot locate. His name was attached to a backcountry use permit filed in 1976 for the corridor itself, not an adjacent area, the corridor proper, the first such permit I had seen since our 1961 survey. I found his name through a park administration contact and made several attempts to reach him through address records and telephone directories across 3 states. I have not been able to find him. The permit was filed with a completion date of 10 days after the entry date, and there is no completion report attached to the permit number. There is no indication in any record I can access that he returned from that corridor, or that his failure to file a completion report was ever formally noted or acted upon. I am aware that this absence does not constitute evidence of anything definable. A man can fail to file a completion report for reasons that have nothing to do with what I am describing. I am aware of this. I am also aware that the administrative history of that corridor, from the truncated 1938 survey to our own 1961 attempt to the 4 subsequent permit holders I have tracked, shows a pattern that is not the pattern of difficult terrain or weather or equipment failure. It is the pattern of a boundary that is enforced, and enforced with enough specificity and enough consistency across 38 years to be intentional. The Shoshone elder at Fort Hall in 1961 used the word intentional. He did not. He said the ground should not be surveyed and that the concern was that we would not come back. But what he was describing, in the language of what he did not say, was an arrangement, a thing that had been agreed to, not by one generation of people, but by many, over long enough time that the origin of the agreement had been forgotten. What had not been forgotten was the terms. The terms were, you do not enter certain ground after the first frost. You do not camp on it. You do not survey it. You do not speak of it to federal men. We were federal men. We entered after the first frost. We surveyed. What I am left with, after 18 years, is the framework of the experience, the structure of what happened to us, stripped of the professional language I spent years applying to it. The thing in that basin communicated with us over the course of 4 days, not through language, through the cold, through the bent stake, through the instruments, through the convergence of all of it on the 4th afternoon into an undeniable present tense that left no remaining category for denial. It reduced the distance between itself and us on each subsequent night by a deliberate measure, not randomly, not atmospherically, but as a demonstration. I am closer than I was. I am closer than I was. I am here. The bent stake is the thing I think about most, in the specific way that physical objects carry meaning that testimony cannot fully reproduce. It was a brass stake, regulation size, driven to survey standard depth into Earth that was, by all thermal hydrology, impossible to freeze. It had been bent at a right angle from below the surface, the energy of the bending applied not from above, but from beneath or within, and it had been left bent, not removed, not thrown, not hidden. It had been left visible, at a right angle to the horizontal, in frozen ground that served as its signature. It was a message. I am not using that word loosely. I mean, it was a deliberate physical alteration of an object placed by humans, left in a state that communicated something to humans, which is the functional definition of a message. The message was not subtle. The message was, this is the boundary, and you have crossed it. and I have made that crossing legible to you in a language you will recognize. We did not recognize it in time, or perhaps more accurately, I recognized it and could not convince the framework I was operating in to act on the recognition before it was too late. I still have a single page from my personal field log for that survey. I kept it when we returned the official documentation to the district office. It is the entry from the morning of the 4th day, the morning after the 3rd night's cold, written before we found the bent stake. It reads, in my handwriting, cold again, earlier, sounds changed, birds absent, instrument variance unresolved. Something is reducing the distance. I wrote those last 5 words that morning, and then set down my pencil and did not add to the entry until we were back at the Boise office, when I wrote, Kovville did not come out. That page is the only physical record I have of what happened to us in that corridor. The full 3 weeks of survey data remained in the equipment tent when we ran, and when the Park Service recovered the tent and its contents and returned them to Boise, I was told the data had been reviewed and filed. I made one attempt to access the filed data through the Cartographic Archive in 1964 and was told that the relevant records were not available for review. I did not try again. I think the records may still exist in a filing cabinet somewhere in the Interior Department's Administrative Archive, and I think they have never been incorporated into any active map of that corridor, and I think the person who chose not to incorporate them understood something about what the act of incorporating them would mean, and chose not to mean it. The white space on the federal map of Yellowstone's restricted backcountry northwest of Shoshone Lake is still there. You can verify this. If you have access to the Interior Department's cartographic records, or to the National Park Service's topographic holdings for that boundary area, you will find that the corridor exists on paper as a labeled bounded area, and that the interior of it has never been surveyed to completion. Not in 1938, not in 1961, not in any subsequent federal mapping effort. There have been subsequent efforts. The paper trail for them follows the same pattern as the paper trail for ours. An assignment issued, a permit filed, a partial completion, a quiet administrative closure. No one who has been directed to map that corridor has ever finished the job. The corridor is administratively acknowledged, federally bounded, and cartographically empty. I am not telling you this because I expect it to change anything. I am not telling it to the folklorist recording this conversation because I believe the record will result in some official action or academic revision. I am telling it because there is a survey permit process that operates through Interior and through the Park Service for research and documentation work in the Yellowstone backcountry, and that permit process is still active, and there are people who will look at that white space on the topographic record and see an opportunity, a professional gap to be filled, a career advancement attached to completing what has not been completed. Those people will read the permit history for that corridor, and they will find, as I found, that the record is incomplete and offers no documented explanation for why. The absence of documentation is one of the tools of the administrative system for not saying what it knows. I am offering this account as the thing the administrative record will not say. Do not enter that corridor after the first frost. Do not camp on that ground. Do not survey it. Those are the terms. I did not understand them when the elder at Fort Hall gave them to me in 1961, and Harlon Kovville is not alive because I did not understand them. I am 52 years old this year, and I have not returned to that corridor, and I will not return to it, and I would counsel the same for anyone who reads or hears this account. The thing in that basin has been there for longer than surveying has existed, longer than the federal government has existed, longer than the Shoshone knowledge of it has existed, and it is still there, and it is still enforcing the terms, and the terms are not negotiable. They have never been negotiated. They were agreed to, at some point so far back that the people who agreed to them could not tell their grandchildren what the origin of the agreement was, only what the agreement required. The one page from my field log, the page that ends with Kovville, did not come out, is in a desk drawer in my house in Boise. I have not destroyed it, because destroying it would mean the only physical record of what happened to us in that basin would be gone, and I am not willing for the record to be gone. I am also not willing to let anyone see it who has not already heard the full account, because a page in a field log means nothing without the context, and the context requires the full telling. This is the full telling. If you find a survey permit for the corridor northwest of Shoshone Lake, and you notice that no completed federal map of it exists after 60 years of diligent bureaucratic process, and you find yourself thinking that the omission must be an oversight, a gap to be filled, an administrative error waiting to be corrected, understand that the omission is not an oversight. It has never been an oversight. Every person who has gone into that corridor and come back has come back understanding that the omission is the most accurate and honest thing on the entire map. The cold arrives at dusk the first night, or earlier on the nights that follow. It feels like something pressing against your body from all sides, like being held at the center of an intention that has waited longer than you have been alive, and is entirely prepared to wait longer than you will be alive. It arrives closer each time. And when it arrives in full daylight, with the instruments flatlined and the basin floor frozen in a ring around the thing you were not supposed to touch, you will see it at the tree line. When you see it, put down whatever you came there for. Put it down with care and leave. Do not send anyone back for it.